My father's hands smelled of salt and petroleum for the rest of his life, even after the surgeries. Even after the nerve damage forced him to stop diving and resign himself to a laboratory stool and a microscope, and the particular brand of quiet suffering that comes from a man who used to read the ocean floor like a page of text, suddenly finding himself limited to a desk. The smell never left him. I asked him about it once, when I was old enough to ask such things without flinching. He told me the bay had gotten into his skin. He said it the way a man says something true that he would prefer not to be true. I was 9 years old when the first one came. I tell people that now, and they look at me the way people look at veterans who start their war stories from the very beginning instead of the part that explodes. They want the fire. They want the sulfur mist and the city full of bones and the sound. The sound is always what I describe last, because once you have described it, there is nothing left to say and the conversation finishes itself. But you cannot understand any of it without the beginning. You cannot understand what we built and why it worked, and what it cost if you do not first understand that it started with a dead bay and an old fisherman and a tadpole nobody had a name for. My father's name was Toru Yano. He was a marine biologist employed by the Coastal Research Station at the edge of the Keihin industrial zone, where the land reaches into the bay and the water runs the color of old motor oil, and the gulls learned long ago not to land on the surface. He was not a famous man. He was not a political man. He read specimens and filed reports and attended the quarterly meetings at the prefecture building and argued with the industrial board about discharge permits with the patient, methodical determination of someone who believes that facts, given enough time, must eventually matter. They never did, but he kept arguing. That is its own kind of integrity. I understand it better now than I did then. The house I grew up in was at the end of a street that terminated at a chain-link fence beyond which the industrial zone began. The cracking towers and storage tanks and processing buildings that had been there since before I was born and would be there. I always assumed, long after I was gone. You could see the stacks from my bedroom window. At night in winter, when the air was clear, you could see the gas flares at the tops of the towers, orange against a dark sky, burning off byproducts. My mother called them the candles. My father did not give them a name. He documented their output in his quarterly reports. I was aware, in the way children are aware of large background facts they have not yet been given the vocabulary to process, that the bay was sick. I knew it from the smell on still days. I knew it from the absence of certain things. The old fishermen talked about shrimp beds that had been thick when they were young, the way you can tell what a place used to be by what the old people are still mourning. I knew it from the color of the water in the inner channel, which was not the color water should be. These were not alarming facts when I was 9. They were simply the texture of the world. The world I had been given was that color, and that smell, and those absent shrimp beds. I had nothing to compare it to except the old men's stories and my father's reports, which I sometimes read because they were the most interesting texts in the house aside from my Godzilla comics, which I kept in a box under my bed, and which I returned to with a devotion that I now recognize as an early form of the comfort that ritual provides. I was playing with those comics on the morning Keihin came to the house. Keihin was a fisherman from down the coast. He had fished the same stretch of water for 40 years, the same lines, the same channels, with the same inherited knowledge of thermoclines and seasonal migrations, and the particular behavior of fish in the hours before a storm. He came to my father sometimes with specimens he could not identify, the strange catch that the nets pulled from the deeper channels when conditions shifted. He was not a man who frightened easily. He had survived typhoons. He had survived the slow economic defeat of watching the fishing grounds die, season by season, as the runoff thickened. None of it had broken his composure. He was shaking when he knocked on our door. The thing in the bucket did not look like much. Black, roughly the size and shape of a large tadpole, which is what I called it because I was 9, and that was the closest reference I had. It had no visible eyes. It moved through the water in the bucket with a slow, deliberate rotation that was not quite swimming and not quite tumbling, more like something that was orienting toward chemical gradients, a compass needle choosing its direction. My father crouched over the bucket for a long time before he spoke. He turned on the overhead light in the kitchen and he held the bucket up to it. He did not touch the specimen. He said, "That is not a tadpole." I asked him what it was. He said he did not know, but that it was not biological. He had been a marine biologist for 22 years, and he did not quite believe what he was saying, but he said it anyway. Not biological. Mineral composite. Something between an organism and a crystal lattice, the differentiation between the two categories being apparently less absolute than he had previously understood. He said it the way you say a thing when you know exactly how it sounds to the person you are saying it to. Keihin told us he had pulled it from the outer channel near the refinery discharge pipe. He said the shrimp were gone. The beds he had worked for 30 years were empty, the water over them dark and viscous in a way that water should not be, and the only things moving in it were small shapes like this one, turning in slow spirals near the bottom, as though following a route that had been laid down in the chemistry of the water rather than in any conscious navigation. My father went diving the next morning. I was told to stay on the rocks. I was 9 and I did not argue, not because I was unusually obedient, but because something about the quality of the water that morning made argument feel beside the point. The surface was still. The stillness was not peaceful. It was the stillness of water that has been changed by what is living in it, altered below the surface in ways that only become apparent from certain angles at certain times of day. I sat on the rocks and watched my father's bubbles track across the surface in a line toward the outer channel, and I waited. What came up out of the water was not small. I saw the shape before I understood it. A mass, dark and wet and irregular, rising from the surface with a sound like something vast inhaling, not the crash of a breach, not the gasp of a whale, but something slower and more deliberate, the kind of sound a building would make if a building were capable of deciding to stand up. It did not have a face. It had an arrangement of dense, layered matter that suggested a face, the way a landslide suggests a sculpture, not formed, but organized, shaped by its own gravity into an arrangement that happened to include forward-facing structures. There were 2 pale regions set into the mass that caught light and held it without reflecting. They tracked me for a moment with an attention that was not curiosity and not malice, and was therefore worse than either, because what it most closely resembled was the way a measuring instrument tracks its subject. Not interested, assessing. Then it turned toward the water, where my father's bubbles were still breaking the surface. I screamed. I am not ashamed of that. I was 9, and it was the appropriate response to what I was seeing. My father made it to shore. The creature did not pursue him, which I have thought about for 50 years without arriving at a fully satisfying explanation. My best current theory is that the juvenile form had already taken in what it needed from the encounter, not my father specifically, but the chemical information his presence provided, the data about what kind of organisms occupied this environment and what threats they represented. Threat assessment. It had assessed. My father did not represent a threat that required ongoing engagement. There were burns on his face and neck where the acid mist had touched him when the thing surfaced, not deep enough to kill, not shallow enough to leave without evidence. He was bandaged for 6 weeks. His left eye never fully recovered its original range of motion, though he never mentioned this, and I only noticed it when I was specifically looking for it, which I did not do often because there are some things you understand that you should not examine too closely if you want to continue functioning at normal capacity. When the reporters came to our house, I told them the creature's name. I had been thinking about it since the morning on the rocks. Words have always worked that way for me. I find them before I understand why, and the understanding comes after. The word came from hedoro, which is a Japanese term for sludge, for the dense, contaminated sediment that accumulates in industrially affected waterways. I had grown up at the edge of a bay that was dying, and I knew the word the way you know the words for things you have lived beside your entire life without needing to speak them often. Hedorah, I said. The reporters wrote it down. It spread through the press, and then through the public with the speed that names spread when they are exactly right, when they land in the mind and stay there, when they feel less like a word someone invented, and more like the name a thing was always going to have. My father worked in his laboratory for 2 weeks without sleeping more than a few hours at a time. He took the samples from the outer channel, the ones he had collected before the encounter, and the new ones the station was pulling daily, and he ran every analysis his equipment supported, and several he improvised with materials borrowed from the university lab 2 hours away. He called colleagues. He called the Maritime Safety Agency. He drafted a report for the prefecture board that was 26 pages and contained 7 separate recommendations, each one more detailed and urgent than the last, with supporting data for all of them. He had been a scientist for 22 years, and he knew how to make an argument that could not be dismissed on technical grounds. You dismiss it on political grounds, or you do not dismiss it at all. The board acknowledged receipt of the report. Meanwhile, Hedorah grew. This is the part that does not translate cleanly into any existing framework for how threats are supposed to behave, and it is the part I have spent 40 years of my own career trying to help people understand at the molecular level. A conventional threat has a fixed size. It occupies space that can be measured and surrounded and reduced. Hedorah did not work this way. Hedorah was not a fixed quantity of matter in a container. Hedorah was a process, a self-organizing chemical process that happened to have developed motility and the capacity for directed behavior. It took in what the bay provided, the petroleum distillates and the sulfur compounds and the heavy metal concentrations, and the organic solvents that 40 years of industrial pipes had been depositing at rates that exceeded what any natural system could process. It converted that intake into mass and structural density and new physical capability. Every liter of contaminated water was substrate for growth. Every cubic meter of industrial exhaust was fuel. The environment we had spent 4 decades poisoning had become, over those same 4 decades, a larder of extraordinary richness, and Hedorah had been developing in it slowly, and we had not known to look. The first confirmed sighting of the developed form came on a Tuesday morning in late summer. 2 cargo tankers went down in the outer channel within the same 60-minute period. The Coast Guard dispatched a response vessel. The response vessel did not respond. The Coast Guard dispatched a second vessel with standing orders to make no attempt at engagement and to maintain observation distance. The crew of the second vessel saw it from approximately 800 meters in good morning visibility, and filed a report that my father read aloud to me that evening in a flat, steady voice that did not waver, which I believe was the bravest individual act I witnessed him perform in all of the events that followed. The creature was now 60 meters in height. It had developed a terrestrial form, no longer purely aquatic, though it retained full aquatic capacity and clearly preferred the transition zones between environments, the industrial margins where land and bay met in a contaminated seam of reclaimed ground and drainage channels and chemical storage. It moved across the land with a heaviness that was not clumsiness. I want to be precise about this distinction because it matters. There is a difference between something that struggles with its own mass and something that simply does not acknowledge the resistance of surfaces beneath it. Hedorah did not struggle. It pressed forward with the indifference of weather, with the unhurried forward momentum of a pressure system that has not been given a reason to change course. The defense forces deployed the following morning. I was not present for the first engagement. My father sent my mother and me inland, to a relative's house in a prefecture outside the projected advance zone. He did not come with us. This was not a discussion. My mother knew him well enough not to make it a discussion. She packed what she could carry and she took my hand, and she did not look back at the house at the end of the street with the chain-link fence and the candles burning at the top of the stacks, and I looked back for both of us. We were at my aunt's house for 4 days. I watched the news coverage on a small television in the corner of the living room, and my aunt watched it with me because she did not know how to tell a 9-year-old to stop watching. The coverage was intermittent and inconsistent, and frequently wrong in its specifics. What it conveyed accurately was the scale. The cameras that could get close enough to be useful were close enough to be in danger, and the footage from them showed what happens when a very large, very dense thing moves through a city at the pace of something that has no reason to hurry. It does not look like destruction. It looks like weather. It looks like the slow transformation of a landscape by a process that does not acknowledge the landscape as anything other than material. I will spend less time on the weapons phase than it occupied in real time, because the documentation of it is thorough, and the lesson it offers is simple, and I do not want to make the lesson feel more complicated than it is. Conventional ordnance was fired at a creature that could not be permanently damaged by conventional ordnance, for a specific reason. The damage sustained by any given section of Hedorah's body was repaired by the recruitment of new mass from the surrounding environment, continuously and in real time. Every surface wound was filled by the substrate chemistry that Hedorah carried within its distributed body. Every penetrating strike created a channel that closed behind the penetrating object. You cannot wound a process. You can disrupt a local structure, but if the process continues, the local structure reconstitutes. The shells went in and the wounds closed, and Hedorah continued moving forward, and the defense forces took casualties and retreated to a new perimeter, and then retreated again. A colonel whose name I learned only years later filed a report on the 3rd day of the engagement describing what his unit had observed and concluding, in the precise, careful language of a man trained to file accurate reports regardless of what those reports contain, that the target was not susceptible to attrition by available means. He had been a soldier for 30 years, and he had never written a sentence like that before, and the report shows it. The sentence is very short and sits in the middle of a long technical document with the blunt finality of a door closing. His unit retreated to the outer perimeter that evening. He called my father from a field telephone at 2300 hours and said, "Tell me what you have." My father said he was working on it. The colonel said, "Work faster." The photographs from those 3 days exist in the National Archive. I have looked at them a small number of times, and I do not look at them anymore. They are accurate documents. They are not documents I can engage with for more than a few seconds without the smell of the place coming back, and the smell is, as I said, the last thing I describe. The sulfuric mist was the mechanism of the majority of the deaths. Hedorah produced it as a byproduct of its metabolic conversion process. The chemical transformation of atmospheric pollutants into stored energy generated this condensed acid fog as exhaust, the way a fire generates smoke. In enclosed spaces, it was lethal within minutes. In open air, with wind, it dispersed at a rate that allowed survival if you moved quickly and had shelter and some form of chemical protection. Most of the people in the path of the initial advance had none of these things and no warning that would have allowed them to acquire any. I ran through it. I will not describe the run in full. I was 9 years old trying to reach my mother's school. And the streets were empty and the air had the battery acid quality that I now understand to be a specific concentration of sulfuric compounds in atmospheric suspension. And the buildings were showing the pitting and corrosion that tells you what is happening to the air even before your throat begins to register it. I encountered things in the street that I recognized, after a moment's delay that I am grateful for, as the structural remains of people who had been in those streets when the mist was thicker. I did not stop. I ran with the particular pure focus of a 9-year-old who has a destination, and understands that the destination is the only thing that matters, and that everything else is information to be processed later or not at all. My mother was alive. She had gotten the children into the lowest level of the school building, the storage corridor that ran under the main floor, and she had sealed the door gaps with wet cloth because she was a woman who had been managing emergencies for 15 years in a classroom, and understood without being told that you seal the gaps and you keep people calm, and you wait for the situation to resolve in whatever direction it resolves. She was frightened. She held me for a long time when I came through the door. She did not say anything immediately, and I did not say anything immediately, which was correct. There are moments that require holding first and language later, and this was one of them. My father was already working on the device when I found him the next morning. I want to be precise about what he had understood, because precision is what he would have wanted, and also because the imprecise versions of this story, the ones that describe what followed as miraculous or fortunate, or as evidence of some providential pattern in the way human affairs resolve themselves, miss what I believe is the actual lesson. It was not a miracle. It was a man who had spent 22 years studying what he thought was the wrong problem, suddenly understanding that he had been studying the right problem from the wrong direction. My father had built his career on documenting what industrial pollution did to marine ecosystems. He had measured the damage and characterized its chemistry, and written the reports, and argued the quarterly meetings. He knew the chemistry of contaminated water the way a combat engineer knows the properties of the ground he is working in, not academically, but operationally, at the level of specific concentrations and specific reactions and specific thresholds. When Hedorah appeared and he began to analyze what the creature was and how it processed its environment, he understood something in the first week that took the broader scientific and military communities several months to accept. Hedorah was not surviving in spite of the pollution. Hedorah was the pollution, animated. The pollution had organized itself. And any system that organizes itself around the chemical properties of water, that depends on hydration the way Hedorah depended on it, that uses water as both substrate and structural component, has one fundamental vulnerability. Remove the water and the system collapses. This is not novel chemistry. It is basic chemistry. It is the kind of chemistry you learn in the first year of any serious scientific curriculum. The difficulty was not the principle. The difficulty was scale. You cannot dehydrate a 60-meter entity through any mechanism that humanity had previously had a reason to develop. Localized heat sources produce localized results in a creature that can recruit new hydrated mass from its surroundings faster than localized heat can desiccate it. What you need is a field effect, a mechanism that acts simultaneously across the full volume of the target, at the molecular level, faster than the creature can compensate. High-voltage electrical discharge, under specific conditions, produces exactly this effect. The ionization field generated between two sufficiently large and powerful electrodes forces the dissociation of water molecules throughout the field volume simultaneously. Ionized water cannot sustain the chemical bonds that give Hedorah its structural integrity. A body that is 80% hydrated chemical composite, caught within a sufficiently powerful ionization field, loses coherence across its entire volume at once. It cannot recruit replacement mass fast enough. It crumbles. My father worked through the calculations for 3 days. He covered 14 whiteboards in the research station's largest room with equations in handwriting that deteriorated from precise to urgent across the 3 days, and then, on the morning of the 4th day, resolved back into clean, careful script on a single sheet of paper that I still have. He ate standing at the bench. He drank coffee in quantities that would have caused most people significant physiological problems. He called the power station superintendent and the chief structural engineer at the industrial complex, and the Defense Forces logistics coordinator, who had been leaving increasingly urgent messages for 2 days requesting his assistance in developing a tactical assessment of Hedorah's behavior patterns. He told the logistics coordinator, "I do not have a tactical assessment of behavior patterns. I have a mechanism to eliminate the threat. Do you have construction capacity and the authority to redirect the complex's full power generation?" The coordinator said yes to the second part and probably to the first. My father said, "Then listen carefully, because I am going to explain this once, and then I am going to need to stop talking and start building. The electrode array would require structures of a scale that had never been constructed for this application. Two large conducting surfaces, positioned to create a field zone large enough to contain the full mass of the target simultaneously. The structures would need to withstand the mechanical and chemical assault of a 60-meter chemically aggressive entity long enough for the discharges to take effect. The power routing would need to draw from every generator in the Keihin complex, coordinated through a single control system that my father would build himself because there was no existing system designed for this application. The timeline was measured in hours. I was put to work. I state this plainly because I was there and I was useful, and I am tired of the formal histories that reduce the events of those 2 days to the adult engineers and the Defense Forces personnel, which is accurate but incomplete. I was 9 and I was small, and what I could do was run. I ran messages between my father's laboratory and the construction teams working in different sections of the array site. I carried parts lists and wiring diagrams folded inside my jacket across distances that were too dangerous for adults, because adults were needed at the construction points, and I was not. I fit through gaps in partially blocked access routes. I climbed to cable junction points that were accessible to a 9-year-old, and not to a grown man in a hard hat. I ran Sector 7 cable with a Defense Forces engineer named Nakamura, who had a photograph of his daughter tucked into the front pocket of his uniform, and who never mentioned it but touched it once briefly, when he thought I wasn't watching, in the specific way that people touch photographs of people they are not certain they will see again. What I remember most clearly from those 2 days is not, as I said, the fear. Fear had resolved itself into a functional state, heightened attention, lowered threshold for relevant information, reduced engagement with irrelevant information. You do not feel afraid in the same way when the fear has been continuous long enough to become the operating condition rather than a temporary exception. You feel careful. You feel deliberate. I ran cable and I carried diagrams, and I was careful and deliberate, and I did not look at the eastern quadrant of the refinery complex more than I needed to. What I remember most clearly is the smell. The compound smell of those 2 days in the array construction site. Ozone from the electrical equipment, petroleum from the refinery operations that were being maintained deliberately as an attractor, the chemical sharpness of Hedora's mist at low background concentrations, present throughout the complex by then, not lethal but perceptible, a constant reminder that the boundary between what was outside and what you were breathing was not as absolute as you preferred. Cutting through all of it, the smell of solder and hot metal and human sweat, which are the smells of people working at the edge of their capacity on something that matters. And underneath all of that, faint and incongruous, the smell of the sea. That was my father, standing at the control board he was building in the center of the array. He always smelled of the sea. He smelled of it the way the bay had gotten into his skin, all those years of diving and sampling, and standing at the edge of the water filing reports that went into a drawer in a prefecture building, and did not change anything. And he was standing there in the middle of all of this smelling of salt and petroleum, and working with absolute focus on the problem in front of him. I think about that often, the smell of the bay present in the body of the man who was trying to fix what the bay had become. It seems like the kind of detail that should mean something. I am a scientist, which means I am professionally skeptical of the impulse to find meaning in the accumulation of specific details, but I think about it often. The array was completed 37 minutes before Hedora reached the target zone. The target zone had been selected based on my father's analysis of movement patterns and feeding behavior, the report he had not written for the logistics coordinator because there was no time, the analysis he had been conducting internally and continuously from the moment the creature came ashore. Hedora was predictable in one respect only, but it was the right respect. It moved toward the highest available concentration of its preferred intake compounds. It did not deviate from this vector for territorial reasons or behavioral complexity or anything that suggested a capacity for strategic thinking beyond the immediate chemical gradient. It was feeding. The Keihin refinery complex was the densest concentration of atmospheric and chemical pollutants in the region, and Hedorah had been moving toward it since it first emerged. My father had simply ensured that the most attractive feeding point in the complex, the stack that was still producing maximum output, operated remotely at his insistence, was inside the array boundary. The creature came into the array at 3:47 in the morning. It came because the stack was inside the array, and the stack was producing, and Hedorah's chemical navigation was functioning exactly as my father had predicted. It moved through the gate structures of the array without apparent awareness of their significance. They were large steel constructions, and Hedorah had moved through large steel constructions before without noting them as anything other than terrain features to be displaced. The array did not look like a weapon. It looked like industrial infrastructure, which is what it was. Industrial infrastructure that had been repurposed, the way most things that save you in an emergency are repurposed, jury-rigged, fitted together from what was available rather than what was designed for the task. I was in a concrete bunker 15 meters from the array control station. I had been told to stay in the bunker, and I was in the bunker. The bunker had a small high window, not quite at head height even when I stood, and through this window I watched Hedorah move into the array with the indifferent forward momentum I had been watching for 4 days. It was enormous in the way that things are enormous when you are 9 and have been told to stand still and watch. The stacks of the refinery, which I had looked at every night from my bedroom window for as long as I could remember, were at its shoulder height. The light on the array floor, from the warning systems and the safety lighting and the glow of the still active stack, lit the underside of the creature's mass from below, and the result was a visual that I can describe but cannot fully represent. A vast dark shape, irregular at its edges, moving with the patience of something that does not know it has been lured. My father waited. He waited until the mass readings on the monitoring equipment showed full field coverage, until the instruments confirmed that the primary mass of the creature was within the electrode boundary. This required patience that I only understand now, not then. I know what he was watching when he waited. He was watching a 60-meter creature move toward a stack inside a trap he had built in 2 days from repurposed industrial infrastructure, and he was waiting for the moment when enough of it was inside the boundary, and the creature could shift back outside the boundary before the discharge if he moved too early, and he had one chance at the element of surprise, because after the first discharge, the creature would know what the structures were, and would move to avoid them if there was enough of it remaining to move. He waited. Then he discharged the array. The light was total, not a flash. A flash implies brevity, a bright moment with a before and an after. This was a replacement of visual information. The darkness and the shapes and the warning lights and the glow of the stack and the shape of Hedorah were replaced, simultaneously and completely, by white. For 4 seconds. The instruments recorded 4 seconds. I could not have told you a duration while it was happening because duration requires a reference point outside the experience, and there was no outside. There was only the white and the sound that came with it, not the sound of Hedorah, which was a low floor-felt vibration. This was immediate and simultaneous and massive, the sound of the air between 2 electrode surfaces at full discharge, and it had a physical quality, a pressure quality, that you felt in the chest as well as heard. I pressed my back against the bunker wall and kept my face at the window because I needed to see, and also because I was 9, and 9-year-olds do not, ultimately, follow orders that conflict with the imperative to see what is happening. When the light ended and the darkness came back, it was a different darkness. Hedorah was smaller. Not gone, smaller. The outer layers, the most hydrated regions, the freshest intake, the outermost chemical boundary of the creature's body, had desiccated and collapsed, the structural bonds broken across their full volume simultaneously, and what remained was a denser irregular mass, reduced, moving with the jerky discontinuous quality of something whose internal coherence has been partially compromised. It was not a clean reduction. The collapsed matter had fallen to the array floor in a scatter of gray-black mineral deposits that steamed faintly in the night air. The remaining core had turned toward the array structures with what I can only describe as awareness, a directed attention that the creature had not previously displayed, a recognition that the structures around it were relevant to it in a new way. It fired its acid mist across the array floor. The mist contacted the electrode surfaces, which were still at elevated temperature from the discharge, and flashed to vapor before reaching any of the control structures. It launched pieces of its own body mass, dense fragments, roughly the size of industrial solvents drums, carrying enough chemical energy to leave craters in the reinforced pavement where they struck. 2 of them hit the control station's outer wall. The wall held. My father had specified reinforcement for this scenario. Then he discharged the array a second time. The second discharge was more effective than the first. With the outer layers gone, the field penetrated deeper into the creature's remaining core. The water content of the surviving mass was lower than the initial reading. Some had already been expelled or consumed in the internal chemistry of Hedorah's response to the first discharge, and lower water content meant less structural integrity to begin with, meant the ionization effect propagated further through the remaining volume. The mass readings dropped significantly. What remained on the array floor was moving, still attempting to reach any available intake source, the chemical navigation still functional in whatever portion of the distributed process had survived, but it was slow. It was the size of a large vehicle. It was not yet dead. The array had taken damage from the mass fragments. 2 of the secondary electrode supports had structural compromise. My father's calculations had accounted for this. The primary supports were sufficient for a third discharge, if the charge was routed correctly and the timing was right. He had 40 seconds to reroute. I know this because I asked him afterward when he would talk about it, and he described the 40 seconds in the same flat, precise voice he used for everything, as though the calculation had been unremarkable, as though routing emergency electrical power around damaged infrastructure with a surviving fragment of Hedorah 15 meters away was a normal working condition. For him, by that point in those 4 days, it was. He discharged the array a third time. The third discharge was brief relative to the first 2. The reduced mass required less exposure time, and my father had calculated this, and ended the discharge at 2.3 seconds, which he told me later was the point at which the mass readings showed no remaining structure above the coherence threshold. There was no dramatic visual event. The remaining mass collapsed inward, which is what very hydrated material does when you remove the water from it all at once. It does not explode, it contracts, it falls into itself. It becomes what it was before the water organized it. What was left on the floor of the array was a scattered deposit of gray-black mineral matter, dry and inert, roughly the volume of a modest dump truck's load, covering an area of perhaps 40 square meters in front of the still operating stack. The monitoring equipment confirmed no detectable biometric activity, no chemical activity above background industrial levels, no detectable movement. My father sat down. I had not seen him sit down in 4 days. He sat in the chair at the control board and he looked at the instrument readings, and he sat there for perhaps 30 seconds, and the 30 seconds were quiet in a way that the preceding 4 days had not been quiet, a different quality of silence. Then he stood up and did not sit down again until it was over. He waited 15 minutes at the array door before he opened it. I found out later that he was waiting for the temperature monitoring inside the field boundary to confirm that the residual acid mist had dispersed to safe atmospheric concentration. He was not going to walk into a potentially lethal chemical environment because the instruments said the primary threat had been neutralized. He had been a scientist for 22 years, and the discipline that made him a scientist did not switch off at the moment of apparent victory. If anything, it intensified. Victory is when you are most likely to stop being careful. I came out of the bunker when the array door opened. He did not seem surprised to see me there. He looked at me for a moment, and then he looked at the gray-black deposit on the floor of the array, and then he looked back at me. He said, "I told you to stay in the bunker." I said, "I know." He said, "You ran the Sector 7 cable." I said, "Yes." He said, "It would not have completed without Sector 7. Then he turned back toward the deposit and stood looking at it for a long time, and I stood beside him, and neither of us said anything. The smell was extraordinary in the way that extraordinary smells are not pleasant, but saturated with information. Sulfur char, ozone, the underlying petroleum note of the refinery zone concentrated and altered by weeks of Hedorah's presence, and the final chemical events of the 3 discharges. It was not a triumphant smell. Victory does not smell like anything uncomplicated. It smells like what it cost. The Defense Forces commander shook my father's hand. Several people shook my father's hand. My father accepted this with the expression of a man who is running arithmetic while the ceremony proceeds. I knew that expression well. What he was calculating, as I learned later, was this. The mineral deposit on the array floor represented approximately 30% of the mass that Hedorah had presented upon entering the boundary. The monitoring instruments had tracked the mass reduction across the 3 discharges, and the numbers did not account for all of the differential. Some portion had been expelled in the fragment attacks. Some portion had been destroyed by the discharges and the residue scattered, but the mass balance was not complete. Either something had been expelled before the discharges began, in the creature's initial response to the first proximity to the electrode structures, or there was a portion of Hedorah's total mass that had not been within the field boundary at any point during the engagement. He did not raise this at the ceremony. He accepted the handshakes and the statements and stood for the photographs and waited until the commander had moved on and the technicians were beginning the power-down sequence. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten, the gray that precedes dawn in industrial zones, where the ambient light from the complex never fully disappears. He said it quietly to me, because I was beside him, and I was the only one who needed to hear it immediately. He said, "We got most of it." I asked what that meant. He said it meant the bay would require ongoing monitoring, that the offshore sediment layers would need to be systematically surveyed, that the discharge pipes at every industrial facility in the region would need to be sampled regularly for trace concentrations of the mineral composite that constituted Hedorah's base material. He said it meant that the conditions which had produced Hedorah had not been altered by the events of the past 4 days. The water was still contaminated. The pipes were still operational. The sediment layers at the bottom of the bay still contained 40 years of industrial waste at concentrations that the bay's natural systems could not process. The conditions were unchanged. And while the conditions remained unchanged, the probability of recurrence was not 0. Those are his exact words, not 0. I have heard them in his voice for 50 years, in that specific flat, precise register he used when he was telling you a fact that had implications he expected you to draw yourself. I went home to my mother. She held me for a long time again, and again we did not say anything immediately, and again this was the correct protocol for the moment. Outside, the city was quiet in the specific way that cities are quiet after very large events, not the quiet of ordinary mourning, but the quiet of afterward, the particular collective exhaustion of a population that has been under extreme sustained threat and has come through it, and has not yet had time to process what through means. The days that followed were strange in a way I find difficult to describe cleanly. The threat had been stopped, confirmed, reported, officially declared, and the declaration was true in the same qualified way that my father's not 0 was true, meaning it was true and incomplete simultaneously. The outer districts of the industrial zone were not habitable for 3 weeks due to acid residue and structural damage. The inner bay required all fishing to stop. The economy of the coastal region was in a condition that official reports described as severely impacted, and that the people who lived there described in terms that did not appear in official reports. There were funerals, a significant number. I attended some with my parents because my father believed that attending was a form of testimony, a way of standing next to the specific human weight of events rather than allowing them to be abstracted into casualty figures. He never stated this belief aloud. He simply went to the funerals, and when I was old enough he took me, and I understood without being told why we were there. You go because the numbers in the reports are made of specific people. You carry that understanding into the laboratory with you, into the quarterly meetings, into every report you file and every argument you make. It is not comfortable knowledge. It is not intended to be. My mother went back to her school 3 weeks after the array discharge. The building had acid pitting on the exterior concrete, corroded window frames, compromised roofing on the east wing. Repairs took 8 months. She taught in the undamaged sections during reconstruction, in the specific way that teachers continue working around damage, moving through what remains functional. I went back to my class. My classmates did not talk about what had happened. Children do not have the language for events of that scale, and so we went back to our seats and learned the curriculum and went home and watched the evening news and went to bed. The silence between us about it was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of things being held somewhere for later, when the vocabulary would exist. My father filed a report. 43 pages. 11 recommendations, each more urgent than the last, jointly addressed to the Prefecture Board, the National Environmental Ministry, and the Maritime Safety Agency. It documented, in precise technical language, the mechanism of Hedora's formation, the specific concentrations and compound profiles in the bay sediment that had provided substrate for development, the atmospheric pollution levels that had sustained growth through the terrestrial phase, the industrial discharge patterns that had constituted the primary food source across the creature's developmental period. It specified the monitoring protocols required to detect recurrence at an early stage. It detailed the remediation measures that would need to be undertaken to reduce the probability of recurrence over the long term. It was, in effect, a comprehensive technical account of how we had spent 40 years building the conditions for something that nearly destroyed us, written in the careful, non-accusatory register of a man who has decided, consciously and on principle, that assigning blame is less useful than specifying corrections. The board acknowledged receipt. I am a marine biologist. I have been for 40 years. I work from the same coastal research station where my father worked, at the edge of the same bay, which is not the same bay it was when I was 9. It is cleaner. The sediment remediation program that my father specified in 1971 was implemented in 1987, 16 years later, after a political environment was created that made implementation expedient. Some of the monitoring infrastructure he described exists. The discharge levels at the industrial facilities have dropped, in part because some of those facilities no longer operate at the scale they did in 1971, and in part because the monitoring and penalty regime has teeth that it did not have when my father was arguing about permits in quarterly meetings. The bay is not clean. It is measurably better than it was. It is also measurably less good than it was 5 years ago, because the political will that produced the 1987 remediation effort has not been continuously maintained, and political will is not a stable compound under normal atmospheric conditions. It requires inputs. It requires regular retreatment. My father knew this, which is why his 11 recommendations included not only the technical measures, but also the institutional measures, the reporting requirements, the public disclosure protocols, the monitoring data accessibility provisions that would ensure the political will had continuous accurate information to operate on. Most of the institutional measures were not implemented. I tell my graduate students about Hedora. Some of them know the general outlines, the creature from the bay, the battle in the industrial zone, the scientist with the electrode array. They have seen the photographs. They know the name. The photographs do not convey the smell, and they cannot convey the specific quality of watching a 60-meter entity move through steel infrastructure with the patience of weather, and I do not try to make them convey these things. I describe what happened, and I describe what my father did, and I describe the morning after, standing in the gray pre-dawn light with the mineral deposit on the array floor and the smell of char and ozone and the sea. And then I describe the 43 pages and the 16 years and the quarterly meetings and the partial measures, and I watch them recalibrate. The event is easy to understand. It was large and specific, and it ended. What comes after is harder. What comes after never ends. I tell them what my father told me, standing in the gray pre-dawn light of the array floor, looking at the gray-black mineral deposit. The conditions were not resolved. A process that emerges from specific conditions will re-emerge if those conditions persist. The electrode array was not a solution to the problem. It was a response to a crisis generated by the problem. Solutions and responses are different in kind and in timescale. A response is 4 seconds of total white light at 3:47 in the morning with everything in the balance. A solution is 43 pages filed with a prefecture board, followed by 16 years of sustained argument, followed by partial implementation of a subset of the recommended measures, followed by continued monitoring and continued argument, and continued incremental improvement that may or may not be sufficient to prevent the next crisis. My father spent the second half of his career on the solution. He published. He testified. He attended the quarterly meetings. He revised the 43-page report 5 times over 30 years, updating the scientific basis and the technical recommendations as the monitoring data accumulated and the chemistry became clearer. He argued with the particular patient determination of someone who has seen the alternative and prefers it not to recur, and some of what he argued became policy, and some did not. He died in 1998. At his laboratory bench, which is where he would have chosen to die if choosing had been available. On the desk, when we cleared it, was the most recent revision of the 43-page report, which was by then 61 pages and had been annotated in pencil in the margins with notes toward the next revision. The last annotation was from the Tuesday before he died. It said, in the clean, precise handwriting that had come back to him after those 4 frantic days in 1971 and never left again, the conditions have not changed. The bay was quiet when we buried him. A cold November morning, the kind where the air is still enough to hear the water in the channel, a gray repetitive sound that comes from below the surface rather than at it, the sound of something moving at the bottom. The smell of the bay was present, the complicated compound smell of a body of water that is neither dead nor fully alive but somewhere between, which is where it has been for all of my life, and which is, my father spent his life arguing, not where it needs to remain. I stood at the edge of the pier for a long time after the others had left. I do this sometimes still. I watch the surface of the water on cold mornings. I watch for movement below the surface that does not correspond to wind or tide. I check the chemical readings from the monitoring buoys before I look at anything else in the morning. Not because I believe the specific threat that came in 1971 is simply waiting to reconstitute itself in exactly the form it took then. The conditions have changed enough. The remediation work has had sufficient effect that a direct recurrence of what happened is genuinely less probable than it was. But not zero. My father said not zero in 1971, and the conditions have improved and the probability has dropped, and it is still not zero. It will not be zero until the conditions are actually resolved, and the conditions will not be resolved until the work is finished, and the work is not finished. I stood at the pier until the cold made standing impractical. Then I went back to the laboratory. I have a photograph on my desk. It is not the photograph from the array floor, the formal one with my father accepting the handshake. That photograph is in the National Archive and in the history texts, and I do not need it on my desk. The photograph on my desk is from the morning of the dive, the morning before Keihin brought the bucket to the door, the last ordinary morning, the one before the name was needed. My father and I are standing at the edge of the pier. He has his hand on my shoulder. We are both looking at the water, which is the color it always was, the color that was wrong. We did not know yet what was in it. We were just looking at the water the way you look at things you have been looking at for so long that you have stopped seeing what is actually there. He taught me to look properly. That was the education I received from all of it, not the fear, not the event itself, but the lesson that followed it. Look properly. Name things accurately. File the report. Argue the quarterly meeting. Revise the report when the data changes. Go back to the pier and look at the water again. It is not a heroic lesson. It does not fit well on monuments, but the electrode array is gone now, dismantled decades ago, and the quarterly meetings are still happening, and the bay is cleaner than it was. These things are related. My father understood how they were related. That understanding is what I am trying to pass on. My right hand has a small scar, just below the knuckle of the index finger. The burn from the rocks. I do not look at it often. I do not need to. It is there when I need to remember that the world I work in was not always the world I work in, that the present conditions are the result of specific choices made by specific people over a long period of time, and that different choices would have produced different conditions, and that the choices are still being made. The bay is quieter than it was. The monitoring buoys report. The quarterly meetings continue. The work is not finished. Non-zero, my father said, 50 years ago in the dark, with the ash still warm on the array floor. We keep watching the water.